Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 266 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, technological firm that helps clients manage risk across four key areas. Those areas include sales and sales channels, distributors, resellers, and partners, suppliers, customers, and human capital, which of course includes employees and contractors. You can find out more information on the Red Flag Group at its website, www.redflaggroup.com. Also, on July 14th, I'm involved with a webinar with the Red Flag Group where we start a multi-part webinar series on supply chain risk management. You can check it out at the Red Flag Group website, which is once again www.redflaggroup.com. Today you're in for a real treat because I have back with me Ben Locwin on Super Smart Guy Day. Ben is a compliance aficionado, and today he talks to us about systems versus people compliance programs. As always, Ben is incredibly insightful, and I think you will enjoy this very much. The episode comes in at just over 24 minutes. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I have back with me Ben Locwin. Ben is what we say in the South is scary smart. And that means that Ben is a really sharp guy, but he couples it with something that allows him to explain to us mere mortals a lot of systems analysis, and theoretical underpinnings of compliance programs. I've had the privilege to hear Ben speak and read several of his papers, and he takes really complex ideas and breaks them down in ways that not only people like me can understand, but actually you can put into use in a business setting. So I asked Ben if he could maybe talk to us a little bit about the ongoing debate in compliance circles around the difference between human error and systems. So one of the things that's long been debated in the FCPA compliance community, and I think in a lot of other communities, is should you take a person approach or a systems approach? So Ben, with that somewhat long-winded introduction, welcome back, and I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much, Tom, and I thank everyone who's listening to the podcast right now.
So Ben, one of the things that I think lawyers really don't understand is, or certainly that I've had trouble understanding in my compliance career, is how you can think through the difference in an approach that focuses on the individual employee as opposed to systems to try to prevent whether either catastrophic failures or things like FCPA violations. So maybe why don't you take it from there?
Sure. I guess probably the most simple way to dive into this is to think about a quote from a fellow who was in the continuous improvement realm for decades, and he was credited with actually a lot of the automotive continuous improvement best practices that had gone on after World War II. And he didn't quite get the same in the United States that he had in Japan, though he was an American. And that's W. Edwards Deming. And I think why I would start off with Deming and his philosophy is that there's certainly a lot to read that he has to say. But one of the important parts is he's been paraphrased and quoted as saying, if you can't define what you're doing as a process, then you don't know what you're doing. So I think the important point there is everything that we do, regardless of the industry that we're in, the type of work that it is, everything can be defined as a process. So it could be a simple linear process flow. It could be some sort of multi-level nested process. But the end result is that there's always some inputs. There are some things that get transformed or work that gets executed on the inputs so that you have some output. So in any case, I guess what it really boils down to is to start by understanding and with the belief system that everything in the universe really should operate as a process. And if we wanted to really rationalize what's going on, to find out the root causes of issues and whether or not it's a bad apple, i.e. An individual who's performing the work, or if it actually is something that is related to the systems, what we need to start to do is take a look at this process-centric view of things and then say, now, where are the people interfacing with the work that's going on, and what sorts of things are in play that are creating variation and error in the process so that we can start to minimize that. And I guess that from that point on, I would say everything about understanding the issues and course correcting really falls into the realm of what's called root cause analysis. So a lot of the tools of root cause analysis, whether it be what's called the 5 whys approach or a fishbone diagram, there's a litany of tools, but really the tools are nothing more than a way to structure your thinking. And beneath all of it, it's really just about understanding what sorts of issues the people are responsible for, what problems in the outputs are actually resulting from unclear processes or poor documentation or standard operating procedures that are faulty or difficult to follow. It could be any or all of those things.
Well, Ben, one of the things that, at least in the FCPA compliance world, it's generally recognized that there are 3 prongs to an effective compliance program: prevent, detect, and remediate. And I understand a root cause analysis in terms of a detect prong, particularly after you've had an incident. But how can you use some of the concepts that you talked about and even the root cause analysis in a prevent way? Or is that even possible?
Yeah, definitely possible, and great question. For me, one of the things that I end up teaching a lot with root cause analysis is that the outputs of a root cause analysis shouldn't just be to find fault. It really should be a way to learn more about the process and what's gone wrong so that the systems and process itself can be changed. Because there's a thinking in the field which basically centers around the theme of unless you've changed the process, then you're going to keep getting similar or the same results. So the process is going to deliver whatever it delivers, whether that be right, wrong, or indifferent. So until you change the process and the systems, you can basically expect that you're going to have some sort of output that is going to repeat itself over and over again. So that's where finding blame doesn't necessarily help, and really you want to get deeper into those root causes, and that's frankly why it's called root cause analysis, so that you can drill down below the superficial pieces of the framework to fix and into the things that are actually driving the outcomes and the behaviors. And so I think from that end, in the healthcare world, we have what's called CAPA, and that's corrective action and preventive action. And to specifically address your question, when root cause analysis is done, it really principally is there in order to develop preventive actions. And the preventive action is something which by its name is to prevent recurrence of the problem. So you can correct with the corrective action, but ultimately what you'd like to do is to engineer out or somehow or another fix the system and processes where you don't have the opportunity for that flaw to occur again. And that's really the preventive action approach.
Well, Ben, one of the things you did in preparation for our podcast today was you pointed me to a fellow named James Reason, who has written extensively in this area. And he, in an article called Human Error Models and Management, he talked about this person approach versus a system approach. And yet he gave some examples of where the person approach is used. And that is really over a little bit towards your area in the healthcare field, specifically with nurses, physicians, surgeons, etc. How is it that a person approach can work in that sort of setting as opposed to a system approach that you might need at a chemical plant or other large facility where physical safety is more paramount?
That's a great question. I think ultimately, if you back that up to kind of the beginning of the paradigm, a person approach, as James Reason frames it, is to basically look at the errors that people are committing in the system. And unfortunately, that leads to blaming people for things. So maybe it's inattention blindness, maybe it's that they didn't execute a procedure properly. And the flip side of that is the system approach, where we say, under what conditions is the person working? So these are the standard operating procedures, these are the documentation, the policies that are supposed to govern how the work is getting done. And in situations where you have a high degree of human intervention, so for example, it could be during surgery, you really want to make sure that there's the right level of training in place, you have the proper protocols in place, but also that you're reinforcing the right behaviors over time, using appropriate training, that you're qualifying people to do their work. And you also want to make sure, however, that people have access to the appropriate equipment, instruments, whatever it is that they need to do their work. A lot of the advancement in OR techniques has to do with basically appraising work, and a lot of that came from triage work that was done in the field during wars. And typically what would be seen is that patients wouldn't get treatment as quickly as they needed to for some emergent condition. And so to streamline the ability for the nurses and physicians to get the appropriate treatments to the patients in as short an amount of time as possible, and to do the effective procedures, was really paramount to having positive outcomes, let's say from surgery or some other healthcare treatment. So ultimately, really what we would like to do from the person approach is make sure that the people are able to operate properly within the framework that they are doing. But then if you look back a little bit, you start to understand that all these frameworks really are part and parcel of the systems and processes. So we need to make sure that we're doing our best in order to properly equip the people with the right knowledge, skills, abilities, equipment, anything else that they may need in order to properly execute their work. Because to not do that is basically guaranteeing some probability of failure, and that's really what we're trying to avoid.
Ben, one of the things that Reason said that really intrigued me, that I wanted to ask you specifically about, he said effective risk management depends crucially on establishing a reporting culture. And most people think of hospitals, for instance, as very hierarchical. You have the physicians, doctors at the top, or perhaps the administrators, and then it goes down the chain to the nurses, hospital staff, and others. How can you help create an effective reporting culture when your business model is hierarchical, or is things are just completely different than that now?
Yeah, a lot of organizations have become quite flat these days. In the tech sector, certainly we have lots of examples of organizations being really quite flat, and whether somebody's the executive vice president or a shift supervisor or a staff employee, there are almost no boundaries into whose office you can walk or have a conversation about whatever it is you'd like to. Where the no blame culture really starts to get its legs is when the organization says, regardless of the hierarchy, any misstep that we have, any gaffe in performance, really should be something that we're highlighting so that we have this culture of continuous improvement. In the lean manufacturing approach is typically used in automotive, but now used widely across virtually every industry, semiconductors, aerospace. There's some principles there that really kind of tell the tale of what, for example, the Toyota production system thinks about finding issues, and that's that they say every problem is a gift, because basically no process is ever perfect. So the more you can elucidate the things that are going wrong, then you can course correct so that you have fewer and fewer of those things occurring over time until ultimately you're really driving high reliability systems. So, if I think about that some more, there's really nothing inherently special about Toyota's DNA, for example. It's just that they were doing things that other people weren't doing at the time, and they ran it to really its absolute conclusion. But once people fall into a certain pattern of thinking, people and organizations, of course, because organizations are just groupings of people, what happens is when there are certain patterns of thinking that take roots, they tend to become impervious to adapting to better ways of performing. So I've had a lot of opportunities to create some of the continuous improvement approaches at some automobile organizations, and they really had started almost entirely as carbon copies and derivative of the Toyota production system using lean manufacturing. So for anyone who's listening who's interested on more of that, to just Google a little bit about lean manufacturing should give a little bit of background on how different industries have been using it. But an example is at Hyundai. They've been called a mutation of the Toyota production system. So they've done things a little bit differently, and really by some objective measures, it's becoming more effective more quickly than the Toyota approach. And the same paradigm seems to happen with prize fighters as well. So, I mean, in the boxing world, mixed martial arts world, typically there's one fighter or camp who tends to dominate. There's lots of fame, many pay-per-views, millions of dollars on the line. And then everyone tries to emulate and copy those methods. And that's until there's someone who comes along with the wherewithal to pioneer a different approach. And then, as we've seen throughout the course of high-level sporting events, what tends to happen is everyone says that they're more interested now in thinking differently about it. Oh, someone who was a new upcomer just showed up and, upset some championship title. And what James Womack has said, he was the founder of the Lean Enterprise Institute. He has a quote which I like a lot, and that's, "Different isn't always better, but better is always different." So being able to appraise things in different ways is very helpful. And some of Toyota's success in this space has been to continuously reflect on and refine their various approaches. And this goes back to saying, we have a problem, let's not run away from it, let's embrace it. But, if you think about it, they're still doing this from the inside out. So they're saying, what can we do better? What can we do next? And it's like the metaphor of the fish who doesn't understand that the world outside of the fishbowl isn't underwater. So what these continuous improvement approaches benefit most from are frequent exposures to radical change. And in the lean view of the world, this is called kaikaku. And basically, you're looking for examination from an external and not an internal perspective. Internal perspectives tend to follow along the quote of, if you always do what you always did, then you'll always get what you always got. And so if you're looking for innovation in your process, and I mean real innovation in what you're doing, typically these things come from external pressures and not from internal incremental changes. So it really takes a step back and maybe several steps back to say, what are we actually trying to do, and are we reaping the value that we're intending to out of what we have? And if we're not, then we should look for this really systemic overhaul of things and not just try to tweak a little thing here and a little thing there. And to be able to do that, I think, brings you closer and closer, Tom, to your question of how do organizations, especially ones that are deeply hierarchical, allow themselves the freedom to appraise things that have gone wrong and then address them, rather than just saying, well, we had someone who made a mistake, let's fix the person or get rid of the person. But really it's about, let's understand what's actually happening here, because for the most part, people are not willfully ignorant and they try to do the right things. So it could just be that there was some clarity issues with how they understood their role or the work or otherwise.
And let me see if I can unpack that a little bit in the context of risk management, particularly in the world of, certainly my world of FCPA, anti-bribery, anti-corruption. If my company, Fox Energy, simply duplicates the compliance program of a competitor, we have not really understood what that competitor has, what makes that competitor unique. We wouldn't have the ability to know that. So that if in the sports world, even in the boxing world, if a second or third fighter comes along and tries to copy what an innovator has, they didn't have that amount of knowledge. Every physical specimen is different. Every company is different. So if in the risk management world, if I wanted to take as a blueprint or a framework something that had been successfully used somewhere else, yet overlay it on my company with my risk, with my personnel, with my corporate structure, is that the time to maybe take a few steps back and try to appreciate what my company has differently?
Exactly. I think if you were to take that approach and just put the cookie cutter into the organization, it would be destined to fail. It would be like uprooting a plant and then expecting it to thrive, because as you definitely and absolutely correctly pointed out, everything from the culture, which is the group of norms and behaviors of all the staff, the historical bent of the organization, the corporate memory, is really all driving against that sort of change. Corporations tend to, or organizations, frankly, it doesn't have to be a large corporation, they tend to have an incredible amount of corporate inertia, business inertia, to not drift too far off of what they've been doing. So to try to insert something like that really does require, like I said, several steps back to say, how would we put this in place? Because it wouldn't just work to slap it in place as a carbon copy. We really have to understand how the people would respond to it, how we would have to change our documentation to properly reflect the outputs that we were intending. I think, one of the things that's very interesting is developing people in a human error reduction sort of framework. And organizations can duplicate capital. Company A versus Company B, Fox Energy versus Locwin Energy. Either of these two companies can duplicate what each other has in terms of capital equipment. And so that's just stuff that you can buy off the shelf, whatever it happens to be. But what can't be duplicated is the cultural approach to executing tasks, to fessing up to issues and then resolving problems. And that's the sort of thing that companies just can't copy. So as a tremendous differentiating factor, the companies that do that sort of thing well are certainly much more agile. And I think the James Reason paper is an important one, because this is really where he puts down the framework for his Swiss cheese model of accident causation. And I would certainly invite and encourage the listeners to read this paper. It's very short, but the Swiss cheese model basically says that the only reason accidents don't happen everywhere and in every organization is because of the very fact that there are layers of defense. These defensive barriers are the policies, procedures, maybe safety equipment, training, education, experience. All these layers together reduce the probability of something going wrong, but it doesn't eliminate it entirely. It's never possible to have a 0% probability of an error, a defect, an accident. And so what you really want to do is add more layers of this Swiss cheese so that you can insulate yourself from risk within the organization. And the better able that you are to do that, the less likely you are to experience some sort of problem or defect. And you can also take the existing layers and just shrink up the holes as well. There might be a layer that's your organization's documentation. Well, we certainly know from not only our working with several very large corporations in healthcare, we've worked in automotive, we worked in aerospace, food and beverage. All the organizations have documentation, particularly if they're regulated, let's say, by USDA or FDA, in the case that I often see it. And the documentation is never perfect, and the organizations know it, of course. And the more willing organizations are to ameliorate their documents, to make them more readable, to make them something that employees actually can follow and that drives value, really does help with producing higher quality, repeatable outputs and not relying on people to not make mistakes, because people make mistakes and that variation is going to occur, but we can reduce the amount of impact that has on the outcomes by making sure the processes and systems are well designed.
Well, Ben, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time. I have certainly, as always, learned a lot in visiting with you, but I've also had way too much fun. This has been great. But I was wondering if anyone wanted to contact you directly about anything you said or wanted to follow up, could they email you? And if so, how would they do it?
Yeah, they certainly can. My email address is ben.locwin, Locwin, and that's at healthcarescienceadvisors.com. Healthcarescienceadvisors with an S at the end.com.
Well, Ben, thanks very much. I'm going to put this James Reason article in the show notes so that if anyone wants to take a look at it, they can download it and read it for themselves. And thanks for taking the time to visit with us.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom, and thanks everyone for listening.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to just this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you will come back and join us. I post 2 to 3 times a week. And also, if you would give us a review on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it. It would certainly help our rankings. If you have any questions, I'm developing my next mailbag episode, so send them in. You can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening.